problem within our children, behavioural problems, ADHD and other matters and so-called conditions. Did you know that in this country now, diagnosis leads us to believe that roughly 1 in 5 boys and roughly 1 in 6 to 7 girls has some kind of behavioural problem. It might be very, very low end. It might be more at the severe end with young kiddies with real issues. But if you actually apply that, that means that if your boy's in a rugby team, 3 of the 15 are going to have some kind of behavioural disorder. And if your daughter's in the hockey team, probably 2 are going to... Do you believe it? We've talked about this before. Do you actually believe that? What about this? A rate of autism is 20 times higher than it was 15 years ago. Is there, for whatever reason, some kind of issue, some kind of problem that so many of our children are supposedly now being diagnosed with all sorts of behavioural conditions? And what about this? The month of your child's birth could determine whether he or she is going to be diagnosed with having some form of issue or condition. Well, a lot of detail about that, particularly that claim about the month of the child's birth, is contained in a new book, Cracked: Why Psychiatry is Doing More Harm Than Good. I'll be giving you details of cost and publishers in just a second. The author is James Davis. I opened one of my papers yesterday and read an absolutely fascinating piece across 2 pages, and Dr. James Davis joins me now. Morning, Doctor.
Morning, Nick. Good to talk to you.
Thanks for coming on the show, sir. Let's sort of deal with this chronologically. A lot of your information comes from some fairly intensive research work done in Canada.
That's right, yes. A study was published in 2011 in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, and it looked at over 1 million Canadian school children between the ages of 6 and 12. And what it found was actually very startling. It found that boys who were younger in their class were 30% more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than boys who were the oldest in the class. And then when we actually look at the figures for the girls, the situation is even more concerning. The younger the girl is in the class, the younger girls will be 70% more likely to be diagnosed than the oldest girls. Now, the reason for this very strange finding is actually quite simple. Now, the older children in the class actually have an 11-month developmental advantage over the youngest children.
Yep.
So what had actually been happening was that the younger children's relative immaturity was being wrongly medicalized as ADHD. And the startling thing about this is that wherever that same study has been replicated, whether it be in the United States or in Sweden, etc., pretty much the same statistic is being revealed.
So what do you take from that research? What do you think, or what do you hint at might have happened?
Well, what the researchers say is that what they believe is happening is that just childhood immaturity is being medicalized, is being reread as symptomatic of some sort of disorder. Or if you want to put it this way, what we might be observe occurring here is the medicalization of underperformance. Now, this is quite problematic, because if we are wrongly medicalizing children, the more children who are being wrongly medicalized will mean the more children will receive powerful psychiatric drugs unnecessarily. The more children will probably suffer from the stigma of being unnecessarily labeled mentally ill, and fewer children will be offered non-medical alternatives.
You mention a fascinating expression in the piece in the newspaper, and I'm going to give my listeners details of the book at the end of our chat. False epidemics. Explain to the listeners what that means.
Right, yes. Well, I mean, for the book I interviewed many senior psychiatrists, but one of the most important people I interviewed was a man called Dr. Alan Francis. Now, Dr. Alan Francis was responsible for including the ADHD category into a book called the DSM, which is the book that includes all of the psychiatric disorders. That's a Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, just to bring my listeners up to speed on that, Doctor. Do go on. Yep. That's right. And yes, it includes all of these disorders. Anyway, he included ADHD with a team of people helping him in 1994. And during his interview, he said to me that by introducing ADHD into actually created a false psychiatric epidemic. Those were his precise words.
But by accident?
Well,
or design?
No, it was an unintended consequence.
I see. Okay.
Of putting this ADHD in the manual, because what actually happened was that after its inclusion, hundreds of thousands of children started to be diagnosed with the condition who didn't actually warrant the condition in his view at all. I mean, originally he designed sort of ADHD category to characterize a small set of children. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of kids were being diagnosed with this condition. And one of the main reasons he gave as to why this happened was because once the ADHD label arrived, the pharmaceutical industry then started to aggressively advertise its medications to doctors up and down the country. So they were recruiting senior psychiatrists to speak on behalf of these drugs to other doctors and to research these drugs on behalf of the companies, etc. And this sort of marketing machine, as it were, played a huge role in sowing the epidemic.
And I think it was Dr. Francis who said to you that we have a rate of autism 20 times where we were 15 years ago, which is a pretty powerful sort of example of what's possibly going on, isn't it?
Well, that's right. And again, I think the problem is once these... I'm not going to say too much about autism because we do know there are lots of children who, do suffer from the condition. But again, the question is, are we overdiagnosing this condition?
Yeah. And what do you think?
Well, with respect to ADHD, absolutely. I think we are, without question.
I mean, I've only got a couple of minutes, and then I can already see listeners calling in, and they're going to be shouting at me, not you, because you'll be gone, fortunately. But, I mean, ADHD, it does exist, Doctor. It's just overdiagnosed. Is that a very crude summation of what you're saying?
I would say there are collections of behaviours that have been labelled or called ADHD that are very, very problematic, and they do need some kind of treatment and care. I would certainly say that. But there are collections of behaviours that are also problematic that have been wrongly diagnosed as ADHD. So, it's very difficult to put a figure on how many children are being wrongly medicalised, but we know from statements such as Alan Francis that we're looking at pretty high figures here.
Lastly, what do you hope comes out of your book?
Well, I really do hope that what I try to do in the book is provide all of the information I believe the reader should have in order to make an informed decision about whether or not they want to subject themselves or their child to psychiatric authority.
Fascinating speaking with you, and here's details of the book, Cracked: Why Psychiatry is Doing More Harm Than Good. It's published by Icon this week, indeed on Thursday. James Davis is the author. The price is £10.99.